Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my top 12 favorite movies of 2012. Why top 12? Because I like to go one step beyond the nostalgia critic. And I am going to have to think of a new catchphrase because starting this year, I guess, saying one step beyond the nostalgia critic is kind of obsolete. And that makes me sad. Anyway, I want to make this perfectly clear. These are my top 12 favorite movies of 2012. I don't believe that favorite and best really mean the same thing. Best means that they're just the most impressive in terms of how well they were made and everything. I mean, Citizen Kane deserves best movie of all time, but my favorite movie of all time is definitely not Citizen Kane. So if you don't agree with my opinions, don't worry about it. I don't expect you to. These were just my favorite movies of 2012. And of course, I do have very questionable tastes, so keep that in mind. So I figured I'd talk a little bit about the runner-ups. I have to look at my list just because I have such a poor memory. The first one I want to talk about is Dredd. This was a shame because it got pretty good reviews, a rarity for this kind of movie, and everybody online seemed to love it, yet for the most part it was kind of a flop at the box office. And that really surprised me because it is a really good action film. There was a lot of effort put into staging every single scene, and it has some interesting plot devices too. I liked how they used the psychic chick and all that kind of stuff. It was just really the perfect kind of action film. I don't know if I'd say it was a great action. Well, I wouldn't say it's a great movie, but I would say that it does have great action in it. I'm not really sure why I didn't make the list. I think my expectations were maybe a bit too high. That's one of the big problems with when movies get lauded by certain fans is I really expect to love it, but instead I just really liked it. But there's no shame in that, and if you have not seen Dredd, definitely give it a look. Safe, Jason Statham movie. This was a surprise because even though I love Jason Statham, the movies he appears in are just sort of generic. The action scenes are very standard, the plots are very conventional, there's nothing in terms of characterization. For the most part, Jason Statham is always playing Jason Statham, and I think that his upcoming movie, Parker, looks just like all his other ones. But Safe, even though it seemed like it would just be another Jason Statham movie that I won't remember, it turned out to be surprisingly good. There's a lot of fun in terms of how they flesh out the characters. All the different sides and factions are incredibly interesting, and even though Jason Statham is pretty much playing himself, they do so much to make you like him as a character. And the action scenes were incredibly well choreographed. There's a lot of hand-to-hand fight scenes, a lot of shootouts and all sorts of interesting stuff, but it also had a good sense of humor about itself. So it was all in all incredibly enjoyable. In fact, I'd probably say that I liked it a little bit more than Dredd, even though Dredd, it's hard to compare them because they have very different kinds of action, but I do believe that both deserved a lot more attention than they got. One I'm not really sure I'd consider here, but I thought was kind of overlooked, was The Raven with John Cusack. Didn't seem like many people liked that movie, but I did. I thought it was a pretty polished and interesting thriller. What else do I have? Django Unchained. I expected that to be in my top 12. It wasn't quite that good, but it definitely it had everything that I loved about Quentin Tarantino. And if you're a Tarantino fan, you've probably already seen the movie. But if you haven't, obviously check it out. Incredibly well written in terms of dialogue. The characters are fun. It has a great cast. It was just an all-around really good movie. One that I'm a little ashamed of, The Dictator. It has a very dark and irreverent kind of humor that's very offensive, but I could overlook that. I just thought it was overall a pretty funny movie. I was laughing constantly. It's one of those films that suffers from what most comedies suffer from, though, and that it seems like the first act is its best part, but then it never really matches in terms. It seems like it delivers most of its laughs during the first 30 minutes, and then the rest of the movie was just kind of okay. But I did think when it was funny, it was really funny. The Campaign, which was a surprise because Will Ferrell's movies, I either like him or I don't. I love Talladega Nights and even enjoyed Land of the Lost, but it seems like everything else I've been totally indifferent to. But The Campaign had some really well delivered jokes, and considering I had very low expectations for it, I really enjoyed it. What else can I say? Prometheus, I guess you could go ahead and throw that in there. I love the film visually, and I like the fact that it tried to be something more than just your typical action film, and it wasn't necessarily pandering to the critics too much, but it just it had too many stupid moments, incredibly stupid moments, and that those really undermined the film's genuine intelligent parts. So I guess I'd consider putting it as a runner-up. It was a good movie, I thought, overall, but it was definitely one I was a little bit disappointed with. Anything else? Oh, honorable mention goes to the Cinema Snob movie. I didn't even think about it when I was compiling this list. I'm not really sure if it would deserve to be part of that, but I really enjoyed it. It's definitely one of the best movies I've seen for that budget, and I have seen quite a few low-budget movies. It was just, as a fan of the Cinema Snob, I was completely thrilled with it. I loved the dialogue, I loved how the plot developed, and I appreciate how it wasn't lazy when it came to its gags. It was actually a fairly well-written and clever screenplay, and they really emphasized that. And I appreciate how the direction didn't really distract from the script. And of course, Brad Jones is a great screen presence. And if you haven't read that, or I didn't do a written review, I did a video review. If you have not seen that video review, please check it out. I'm really proud of it. Okay, so let's move on to the list itself. The number 12 spot goes to Skyfall. Now, I am a pretty big Bond fan. I've been watching all the movies all over again, and so far I haven't really been disappointed with any of them, although I've been too scared to watch a lot of Roger Moore's movies. But from Dr. No to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, I think they're all great in their own way. But what stood out to me with Skyfall is that it's definitely the most ambitious when it comes to the action set pieces. Some of the effects in that movie are just stunning, and the cinematography is gorgeous. There was definitely a lot of effort put into the film visually. But really what I thought made it great was Javier Bardem's performance as the villain. All of his interactions with Daniel Craig's Bond are fascinating. I loved the overt homoeroticism there. His dialogue is great. His performance is very hammy but totally hypnotic. I just loved that guy, and every time he was on the screen, he stole all the scenes, and he, I think, really is the one who is responsible for Skyfall being exceptional, just because it did have some notable flaws. I felt that it ran out of steam by the third act, and there are some really dumb moments, but that just meant that without Javier Bardem, it would have been a good Bond movie, but his performance made it especially noteworthy. So that's number 12. Number 11 goes to Chronicle. I wish I could say more about this. I'm not a big fan of found footage movies, but when they work, they can be great. But I was nervous because I feel they work best when it's a horror film. I felt that that's the whole point of the found footage gimmick. But what it does is it doesn't treat its first-person point of view as a gimmick. It treats it as a tool to explore these incredibly interesting characters. And Chronicle works because I cared for the people and was scared for them. So that really built up the suspense, and that's really what it comes down to, is if you care for the characters, that automatically creates suspense, so you're into what's going on in the movie. But it's not just like a character piece or anything. It has a lot of really well choreographed action sequences, considering it had a relatively meager budget, especially compared to something like Skyfall. All the action scenes were incredibly well framed, and the special effects were spectacular for that budget, and that's, I think, why I gave it a higher rating than Skyfall, as Skyfall had so much more money to work with. Well, Chronicle pretty much did the same thing in terms of its action, but with a significantly less amount of money. So that was my number 11 spot. Number 10 goes to Argo. Now, a lot of people are surprised about this just because Argo has been placed so much higher on other people's lists. Well, the reason why I put it on this list in general is I really love the first half of the movie as they're planning out this fake movie. It's incredibly funny. The dialogue is really clever. Yet there's also a fair amount of suspense to it, and the characters are played by great actors who breathe life into their roles. I thought the first half really was probably like the best first half of any movie of this year. But then the second half, it seems like it starts focusing on the more generic characters who the movie wasn't very interested in exploring. I felt Ben Affleck's lead was definitely the most unengaging character of the main characters. So because they focus on him and a bunch of other people whom I don't care for, that kind of diminished the suspense, and it was much less funny. It was more serious, but it was still good. I'd say the first half of Argo is spectacular. The second half is good. I was totally into it, but I wish maybe the second half felt more right with the first half, but I guess I can't really totally blame the movie for the tone shift, just because I'm not really sure how they could have done it without it being done in poor taste. But still, Argo is definitely a great movie, and you should check it out. Number 9 goes to The Dark Knight Rises. Now, I don't think The Dark Knight Rises is a great movie, but I do think that it's a great sequel. Almost everything that works about it works because I loved the previous film so much. So, even though there's not a whole lot of new development for the characters, based on what I had seen in the previous films, I still cared so much, and I thought it was the perfect resolution to this trilogy. It's a very flawed film. I thought there was a few too many subplots, and it was longer than it needed to be. But I thought the struggle between Batman and Bane was pretty interesting. I thought Bane was a really compelling villain, and I enjoyed Tom Hardy's performance, and it had some real cool epic scenes. It was definitely the largest Batman movie in scale, anyway, at least of the Nolan films. But more importantly, I cared for the characters, and that made it all the more meaningful to me. So, not a great movie, but I thought it was a great resolution to the trilogy. Number 8 goes to Ted. I wish I could say more about this, but I just thought Ted was incredibly funny. I was worried that Seth MacFarlane would be a bit too Family Guy-ish, and that I thought there was a time when Family Guy was incredibly funny, but these days it seems like it's just running on fumes. It no longer has that same impact. But Ted really took everything that I liked about Family Guy, repackaged it, did its own thing, but also had a lot more that I guess Seth MacFarlane couldn't have done in a TV show like that. But all in all, I just thought it was hilarious. I thought the actors had a lot of fun. It's nice seeing a good performance from Mark Wahlberg. I think he's much better when it comes to comedy than he is when it comes to more dramatic roles. He's really boring when it comes to his more serious stuff, but whenever he appears in a comedy, he usually makes me laugh. So that was really good. Number 7, The Raid Redemption, a great martial arts film, but that's really all it is. But where I loved it is that I am a huge fan of this genre. Obviously, it's like half my namesake. But The Raid, the first half of it is just pure action, but what makes it stand out is that there's a lot of intelligence behind the action. You're focusing on the strategies these characters dream up and how they try to overcome the situation at hand. So it's not just a bunch of explosions and violence, but you get a lot of that too, and the violence is definitely heavy, and it adds something new to the fight scenes, because that's what the second half of the movie begins to focus on, the martial arts. And the martial arts are great in terms of choreography. There was obviously a lot of effort put into it, but the violence makes it fairly unique, because even though I've seen many gory martial arts films, usually it's not to this it's not this excessive. Even though I have seen gorier martial arts movies, you don't see a whole lot of them. So all fans of martial arts need to watch The Raid Redemption. And even if you aren't really a fan, I think it's worth checking out just because it is exceptional for its genre. Number 6, 21 Jump Street, which is probably my favorite full-blown comedy of the year. I was surprised because I'm not really a big fan of Channing Tatum or Jonah Hill, but from beginning to end, the film was non-stop laughs. And I kind of am going to refer back to my statements on The Dictator. Most comedies tend to be their funniest during the opening act, but then they run out of steam after that. That's because it pretty much plays all of its cards too early. But 21 Jump Street never slowed down. It never bored me. Whenever it tried to be dramatic, they still managed to make that funny. It was incredibly violent at times, surprisingly, but more importantly, I just thought it was hilarious, and that's nice to see a comedy that is hilarious from beginning to end. Of course, let me warn you that humor is subjective. You might find the movie to be totally boring, but I thought the jokes connected with me anyway, very consistently, so I definitely would recommend at least you watch it. Number 5, The Grey. I'm going to sort of quote Brad Jones when he said, it's even though it's a survival movie, it's more about death. That's pretty much the perfect way you could describe The Grey. What I like about The Grey is that it blends your typical popcorn action film with a much deeper character understudy. And one of the things I didn't like about a lot of the reviews who didn't care for The Grey is they criticized it for having a lot more action than most of these kinds of movies. They like the slower, more dramatic stuff. But I really appreciate it when a movie comes out and it brings what I like about these, those slower character-driven pieces, but then combines it with a more popcorn thriller or action movie, and to me that makes it more exciting, and I feel that it's more tailor designed for me. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the really slow films. I'm one of the few people who doesn't like 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't think that movie needed to be as long as it was, and I just found it to be sort of boring, even though I respect it. But The Grey, I like how it could play both sides of the same coin. I don't know how that really made sense, but I think an exceptional film, and you should check it out. Now, number 4 is probably going to be my most controversial on this list, The Expendables 2. This is another movie that's tailor-made for me, I guess. What I like about The Expendables and the sequel is even though they're definitely hardcore in terms of action, they emphasize the interactions between all of these action greats. So, I don't really watch these movies just for the action sequences. I want to see Stallone interact with Jason Statham or Chuck Norris or Van Damme or whomever. And I thought The Expendables 2 did a good job at giving me that. It seemed like everybody had enough to do, and it was just fun watching them all together. Then I thought the action scenes were good in that they weren't trying to be too stylish. They were relatively simple, like what was popular in the 80s and early 90s, where the direction pretty much is make sure everything is framed perfectly, but then just let the gunfights and explosions show off themselves. Don't get in the way of any of that. And I really appreciated that, because more importantly is, when the action doesn't distract us from the interactions of these stars. So that is why I love these Expendables movies, but I thought The Expendables 2 was much more of a throwback than its predecessor, and you might even enjoy that one more if you didn't care for the first film. Number 3 is Cabin in the Woods. It's not particularly scary, but it is really clever and funny. I just like how it knows the limitations of this genre. It knows the conventions and cliches, and it uses them creatively. And the end result was Cabin in the Woods was incredibly funny, but it was just also really well written, and it goes into some territory that I was not expecting. I mean, throughout the first 2/3, I'm seeing a kind of a typical, although satirical horror film, but then it ends up becoming something much more by the end of the movie, and I just really liked how that played out. So Cabin in the Woods, you were great. Number 2, The Avengers, which is kind of surprising because that's the second movie of Joss Whedon's that has appeared in this list, and I'm not really a big fan of him. I always feel that his dialogue is incredibly overwritten, and his TV shows are incredibly overrated. But The Avengers was just everything I wanted out of it. It had the biggest and baddest action sequence, I mean baddest in a good way, action sequences of all these Marvel films. The special effects were amazing. They were even flawless, but much like The Expendables, it relies on the interactions of its characters. When I watch The Avengers, yes, I want really good action scenes, but I also want to see Iron Man and Captain America play off each other. I want to see the differences in personalities and stuff like that. And The Avengers delivered more than I would have expected. Everybody was interesting. It had the best interpretation of the Hulk, in my opinion. And watching everybody play off each other was incredibly fun. And the dialogue was very funny too. So The Avengers, I thought, is arguably the best comic book adaptation that I've ever seen. Arguably. I mean, there's some close calls. Like I thought The Dark Knight and Iron Man are close rivals, but The Avengers at least is giving those movies a run for their money. But the number 1 film of 2012 is Looper. I wish I could sum up why I love this movie, but it's almost complicated, too complicated to describe in a short amount of time. Quite simply, I thought the characters were incredibly interesting. I love how they were morally ambiguous. You could understand why everybody is doing what they're doing. It's just a question of, do you agree with them? Like Bruce Willis, his character does go too far, but at the same time, it's hard to hate him because you know why he's doing everything. And, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, he's kind of playing an asshole, and but at the same time, you're always rooting for him. And this is one of those movies where you want all sides to win, but you know that's not going to happen. And the plot is incredibly interesting. I love the little divergences in the story, the stuff that you wouldn't expect to be really huge, but then it ends up becoming that way. And I like how they play with the time travel paradoxes. And to me, it's one of those movies that took what could have been weaknesses and turned them into its strengths. And more importantly, I thought it was just a really good thriller. Once again, like The Grey, it is nice to just see a good popcorn flick that just happens to be incredibly well written and directed and acted. It's funny because Bruce Willis has had some big successes and incredible misfires in these past few years, but I'm glad that he was able to appear in Looper, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt deserves a lot of credit for definitely emulating or I guess I should say imitating Bruce Willis's mannerisms while doing his own thing. So I definitely say everybody without a doubt should watch Looper. So if you want to read my written reviews or maybe watch the videos, I have a link in my description where I have my written version of this list. Please check it out, and I'll do worst videos soon, or worst movies of 2012 videos soon. So that is all. See you guys later.